Welcome, everyone. This is the National Security Decision Making Game Group, and we're doing a lecture today on the roots of steampunk, focusing on the works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells for DragonCon Goes Virtual 2020. And we're just so happy to be with you. For those of you who are wondering who we are, we've been involved with DragonCon for a long time. We're a not-for-profit educational group founded in 1990, and our first appearance was at DragonCon 1990. We provide games and seminars on historical, military, and technology topics. We're devoted to understanding how world decisions are made and devoted to sharing the stuff we learned along the way. Our team has a lot of former military, government, academic, and business people involved with it, and a lot of people with wargaming experience. We appear at hobby conventions, academic, and government venues. Also, all our presentations are based on public information. We use excerpts and pictures under the Fair Use Doctrine and Creative Commons. Any opinions, errors, or omissions are ours, and none of our content should be considered to represent the opinion or policies of our past, present, or future employers, especially the U.S. government. NSDM can be found in a lot of places, and this year still, you can catch us at Escape Velocity Online, which will happen over October, November in the evenings. More information will be out on that soon. And in most years, you'll see us at Origins, Gen Con, and DragonCon like we are here now. We also can be found on our social media sites. We have a Facebook site and a National Security Decision Making Game YouTube channel with all our lectures that have been done this year. And we'd like you to join us on those as well. So this lecture is all about the roots of steampunk. So we start off with a definition, and basically it's a subgenre of fiction that incorporates imaginative and futuristic concepts using the lens of technology and the aesthetic designs inspired by the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Everything from the works of Shelley through the works of Verne and Wells and others. Now, why did we pick Verne and Wells? It's because both have been called the father of science fiction, and despite the fact they have antecedents and contemporaries, they provided the archetypes for almost everything that follows. Everybody that we see in modern science fiction almost entirely use the same story elements that they popularized. And even though they might not have originated it, they popularized it. So some of those story elements are things like extraordinary adventures, which were the basis of a lot of Verne stories, using exotic places, cultures, fantastic flora and fauna, advanced technology that focuses on industrialization, steam, and electricity, generally things that do not involve combustion engines. And almost uniformly, they have eccentric technologists and mad scientists, people who are eccentric and inquisitive and sometimes downright crazy. So one of the things we want to talk about is timeline of the 19th century. Mark, would you like to cover this?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to point out is that H.G. Wells is essentially 2 generations later than Jules Verne. Jules Verne was in the middle of his major writing phase when Wells was born. If you notice, interestingly, the two authors seem to have a cluster of their major works all within Wells, within a 5-6 year period of start to finish. Where Jules Verne over about 15. Now Wells was active all the way through toward the end of his life after World War II. But here we're focusing on, of course, the 19th century and the early 20th. This timeline has, framed by Halley's Comet, come around at the beginning and at the end. So this is one passage of Halley's Comet around the sun. And down at the lower end, we have Neptune is discovered, Darwin's Origin of Species, just before 1960. You have the Civil War there. We'll be discussing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the way that the Hunley, and at the time its contemporary, the Plunger, the French submarine, had to do with shaping Jules Verne's vision of what submarine warfare is going to be, how that's going to come out. We have Jules Verne beginning to write some of his major works, Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, all in that period when H.G. Wells was being born. H.G. Wells then took toward the turn of the century. He had a very prolific time period just before Victoria passed away and King Edward ascended to the throne. And then, of course, around the turn of the century, the Wright brothers having their flight. H.G. Wells would write substantially about that in The War in the Air and Into the World Set Free, about having air flight and how it's going to be affecting warfare, about the time Jules Verne is, in fact, passing away. And then there's toward the end we have Halley's Comet coming around again, and World War One. Nah, that's fine. Thank you. Key inventions of this time period. Now, this is a very prolific period for mankind's development technologically, evolutionarily. We list the Nautilus submarine up here. That is Robert Fulton's Nautilus, built for Napoleon, which kind of kicked a lot of things off, started things going. Electric battery, but we didn't have much use for electricity until later on in 1837 when the telegraph was invented. It's the first actual practical application of the whole electricity thing. Tin food allowed us to start moving foodstuffs around. The steam locomotive was applying, of course, the Industrial Revolution, actually transporting things. Other things big in this period, the machine gun, of course, revolutionizing warfare, dynamite, telephone, moving pictures, aspirin, the automobile, and the diesel engine, all the way major things that began to change civilization in the 19th century.
So the one thing I'd like to point out here is, if you see the trend, you're moving towards more of what we think of as the modern industrial era. And in particular, one of the key points I want to bring out is the Colt Revolver, which is one of the first items that was built with interchangeable parts. So that's where you start thinking about how the Industrial Revolution takes place, and that's a good part of what drives the steampunk future that we talk about. So one of the other keys here is what we want to address is the similarities in style and approach and the differences between Wells and Verne. And the first thing that we probably should stress in particular is they very much are creatures of the countries they came from. Verne has a very egalitarian outlook on many things, somewhat romantic outlook. Wells has the British imperial outlook. It's very much more a one world view, and it's more dialectic. It deals with those kinds of issues. So Verne is using science in his stories to breathe life into travel adventure stories, and most of his stories were considered extraordinary adventures that had science wrapped around them. Where H.G. Wells had a difference that was the second building block of what I contend was the start of steampunk, where he basically wraps science around social issues. So in the one, you've got adventure. In the other, you have social issues, and those become the foundations of what we see in modern steampunk.
Yeah, and the interest in exploring social issues or using the may have also been a generational thing. H.G. Wells was in a period when the world was trying to change itself. A lot of these structures that go back to the Dark Ages or the Renaissance were being questioned.
Another element of this that I think is particularly interesting is the era provides many of the stereotypes that we see come out in modern steampunk. Basically, the racial and national stereotypes of different kinds of Europeans, whether they're Spanish, French, English, German, whatever, are underlying a lot of the stories, and you see those strongly represented in the works of Verne and Wells. And it's the concept that the white man and Europeans are superior. Where Verne talks about it as sort of a state of nature kind of thing, Wells talks about it as a social Darwinist, that we're ahead of them and it's going to take them a long, long time to catch up. But one of the things that underlies both of their discussions is a keen sense of social class and a keen sense that some form of egalitarian group of science-minded people should be running societies. And that's a good part of the basis of modern steampunk as well, but it's intertwined in almost all of the stories that both of these people did. Now, in some cases, they also get science wrong, and we'll talk about those cases because in modern steampunk, there's a little more attention to see that most of the time the science works because we know more about it. But sometimes they'll get it wrong, and sometimes they'll just hand wave it for dramatic effect. You know, one of Wells' issues was the impossible possible would be one of the things he would build a story around. Mark, you want to pick up here?
Yeah, okay. Some of the classic elements of science fiction at the time. You know, they were discussing, of course, time travel, teleportation, mind control, telepathy, telekinesis, aliens in some form, extraterrestrial life forms. They're kind of touching on that. The nature of the entire universe is being questioned and looked into. But space travel and exploration, of course, the primitive 19th century view where you put people in a cannon that get turned into mush on launch, but and interplanetary warfare. Parallel universes getting touched on a little bit in completely fictional worlds. But a recurring theme throughout this is the role of science and scientists. Are they doing things right? Are they doing things wrong? The evil scientists, the mad scientists, the inventors. A nod to Mary Shelley here in Frankenstein. We're not going to go into any detail with her, but she largely kicked off the whole idea of this science genre in terms of, well, how many science fiction stories do you know where a scientist makes something that maybe he or she should not have made, and then has to deal with the consequences or take charge and control the outcome of that. You know,
so the real concern is when they say, what have I done?
Yes.
So other technologies and themes that they deal with are steam power. A little bit they get into combustion engines, and Wells does a lot more of that because he crosses the turn of the century. Lighter than air flight. And back in Verne's stuff, and even in some of the other stories, they talk about the hollow earth because they presumed that the earth had been around so long that it had cooled internally rather than still being warm, as we now have a better concept of. And they generally talk about ballistics, not rockets, so it's artillery. Aliens, kind of, sort of. And time travel. So this is not just confined to Wells and Verne. They had a lot of contemporaries like Flammarion, Stevenson. All of these people did articles and stories that relate to some of the themes that you'll see in steampunk. But Verne and Wells basically cover the entire gambit and popularized it in a major way. One of the other things that helped fuel the imagination of these writers and basically outlines some of the fantastic interrelationships that we normally see in steampunk today are the great expositions that were done from the 1830s through the 1880s or so, where they would bring the works of industry of all nations in. And the one in particular that was important was the Great Exposition in London that was held in the Crystal Palace. And that had an international audience, and Verne is known to have went there, for example. It basically had 13,000 exhibits, 44 countries exhibiting, and 6 million visitors, which is equivalent to about a third of what the British population was at the time. So they had a lot of foreigners come in to see that. And the proceeds from that were used to found 3 museums, trusts, and grants that are still active today. So Jules Verne is the first author that we want to spend significant time on. And he was born in 1828. He's the second most translated author in the world. He was basically educated initially in religious schools and tried to run away from home at 11 to sail to the Indies. And his father caught him in a port in England and brought him home. His parents had planned for a career in the law with him. And he was in Paris issues that were going on there. He also started seeing some of the health problems that he had throughout his life, colitis, and then later on facial paralysis and partial facial paralysis that he dealt with off and on through his life. What's particularly interesting is he met and collaborated with André Dumas on a play. The same guy who did The Man in the Iron Mask was one of his mentors, and he became fast friends with the guy's son. And then in 1861, he appears as an author with 5 Weeks in a Balloon. His career really hit stride in 1863, and you can see the pattern of his major works. His really popular stuff was all done between 1863 and about 1875. Mysterious Island, for example, is a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But he continued to write all the way up to 1904, and actually I think a little beyond that. The other thing that's interesting is one of the works we find most exciting about him is one he wrote in 1863 but was not found and published until 1994 because his publicist said, no, it's too fantastic, nobody will buy it. And it's about Paris in the 20th century. We'll talk about it in more detail later. So now the first item is From the Earth to the Moon. This was a story primarily that dealt with the development of a space gun called the Columbiad, which was built by a Baltimore Gun Club after the Civil War by a bunch of Americans. And they placed this huge gun down in Florida, And the idea was to build a huge ballistic weapon that you could fire a capsule with people into space to go to the moon. His science was off in two critical respects. One, the design he had, he'd done some rough calculations. The barrel needed to be longer to make it work, and he had a real significant problem. He didn't have a way for the passengers to survive the acceleration, but he hand-waved that. The book, From the Earth to the Moon itself, actually ends with them launching to the moon, and the sequel, Around the Moon, deals with them going into lunar orbit, seeing the cold on the dark side, and they failed to land on the moon and came back with a fiery re-entry and landed in the ocean. His moon gun, he had actual dimensions for, and he basically said that the shell that they were going to travel in was going to be constructed of aluminum. It was going to be something that was going to be fired by this hydraulic cannon. What he was right about is that the first space shot to the moon was going to be from America, and it was going to be from Florida. The craft would be mostly aluminum and have a crew of 3. By the way, the command module for Apollo 11 was called Columbiad. Interesting comparison. And his latitude and longitude for the launch was really close. So now we're going to go to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Yeah, I'm a submariner by nature, so I want to talk. I was interested in talking about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Interestingly, it's a first-person narrative. It's supposed to be Professor Aronnax talking about his experience on the Nautilus, and we're observing the 150th anniversary of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea being written. Would be about a few more years before it was translated into English. Next slide. Okay, so Professor Aronnax is washed overboard with two colleagues, a consul, his manservant, his assistant, and a Ned Land, who is a Canadian harpoonist. And it's their observations. An interesting socioeconomic observation. Aronnax as a respected scientist. Captain Nemo enjoys his work, it says he refers to his book almost daily. And Aronnax has a stateroom that's twice the size of the one that his lower tier colleagues have to share. He has his own steward. These are all described by Verne with no indication there's any problem, anything out of the ordinary with the socioeconomic class distinction. That's very different from what something H.G. Wells would have written. Now, Verne's name of the submarine is the Nautilus, was inspired by Robert Fulton's Nautilus, built for Napoleon in 1800. Next. Okay, he gives Nautilus dimensions. He does 230 feet by 26 feet diameter, and he does a very good job working on what the submerged displacement is, how that displacement is going to change with temperature, with pressure, et cetera, et cetera. His exterior dimensions probably seemed huge to him by the nature of the time. It was about 40 feet. Hunley at the time was about 40 feet long and 7.5 tons for Hunley. And the French submarine Plunger, I'll talk about in a second, was 140 feet long. So to Verne, this sounded like a very huge ship. I've never been in a submarine as small as his Stated Nautilus was. So take that as it may. Now, the picture shown here is a diagram of the Plunger. Plunger is an 1863 submarine the French built that used it was a large ship because it used large compressed air cylinders to power the engine. It was the first submarine to get around the limitations of human or muscle power, as the Hunley had, of course. And Verne would have seen these pictures in a model of the Plunger at the Paris World's Fair in 1867, and it's believed that this probably led him, in terms of some of his thought processes, where a submarine could potentially go. This is the model. It's probably not the model that was at the World's Fair. Now, it was advertised as using a spar torpedo similar to the Hunley. It's contemporary, but and it has a ram, which also would have spurred Verne on to potentially a weapon system for the Hunley. Next. Okay, what Verne says is inside the Nautilus wouldn't fit its exterior dimensions. He has many palatial rooms, library, etc., very large spaces. Verne didn't actually either conceptualize how small his dimensions were, or he decided to discuss a submarine as big as people might possibly accept a submarine could be, and then discuss the palatial rooms. Remember, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is primarily an adventure story rather than a science fiction. What he talks about in terms of the submarine is his analysis is usually pretty good, although he glosses over things like this. Go on. Okay, next slide. It's a relatively small submarine, but these are some of the pictures, the original artwork from the original movie, the studies, the library, and the engineering spaces. Next slide. Now, he identifies what he got wrong. He identifies that electric propulsion is the key to the submarine future. While that's probably true, he doesn't seem to have had a grasp of how to make electricity work. I'm not sure anybody did. He has a sodium-mercury battery system, which only the sodium can consume the electric reaction. Now, he seems to think that the way to do this is to replace the electrolyte. In this way, it becomes more like a fuel cell rather than an actual battery that gets recharged. And the Nautilus has to return to their base in the Azore Islands in the hollow volcano to replace the electrolyte, which would be where they have a base there. It's being developed where they make more electrolyte, and it's almost like refueling. Now, he seems to think that they could refuel with this electrical system, electrolyte, and then sail around the world and then come back again. That's what he does. So he's way off in his depiction of what kind of endurance he can get out of these batteries. The crew mines undersea coal to generate the electricity for the sodium extraction. The process is not described. Okay. Sodium mercury batteries is vague about what it is. Nautilus could only get new electrolyte recharge in the Azores, yet they traveled around the world. Next. Okay, Nemo is a person who's decided he's going to remove himself from the surface world, but nevertheless he needs a home port in the Azores, and he goes. There's a deserted island, and there's a volcano that's hollow in the interior, and the Nautilus could reach there through an undersea passageway. There they made the sodium electrolyte. Some tidbits that were wrong. In this regulated temperature, we didn't have to worry about catching colds. The interior was climate controlled, always a constant temperature. The germ theory of infectious disease was not widely accepted at that point in medical circles. So Verne really didn't know that he can catch a cold at room temperature just as easily as anything else. People seem to think often bad humors or bad airs could bring on some of these diseases. Now, Nautilus knew of an underground tunnel that connected the Red Sea, and they passed from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean using it. The Suez Canal was being dug at the time. They discussed the creation of the Suez Canal, how that was going to change things. There's a discussion, Aronnax talks about how volcanoes have been plentiful in the first days of the world, but they're going extinct as the Earth cools. And Merle talked about that, how people were thinking that the Earth was cooling, and that one day the Earth will be frozen because the sun isn't powerful enough to heat a corpse. That's totally backwards, of course. The Earth's source for Earth's interior heat is radioactive decay, and it's probably going to stay warm for longer than the sun is. And also no understanding of how powerful the sun is. There was no understanding at that point of nuclear theory or the energies available to that. So scientists really had no means of understanding how long the sun could possibly stay as bright as it was. He describes how to ballast tank flooding and emptying, all technically feasible. His numbers actually fit as far as the submarine displacement. Archimedes would be perfectly content with what he does. He works out in cubic feet as well as tons. And he doesn't seem to recognize the effects of pressure on depth. He knew the pressure numbers. He talked about how deep the Nautilus would go and what the exterior pressure is, but didn't appreciate what that meant. He said that the Nautilus had reached 33,000 foot depth. It probably originally was 10,000 meters in the original French version. I don't have the sense that he understands what type of pressure that would be, and what type of hull you'd need to contain that. Go ahead. Underwater excursions, he creates diving suits. Now, at the time, divers were hard hat divers. They walked on the bottom. They were weighted, and they had a forced air supply to the original point. He starts into the first concept of self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. So his diving suits have their own air on the back. They still walked on the bottom. His tanks are charged to 700 psi. Probably sounded impressive to Verne, but even diving shallow, that would be less than about a half hour endurance. Verne says he's got 9 to 10 hours endurance on a tank of gas, tank of air. That's not reasonable. Endurance would be dependent on depth. He didn't seem to recognize that. The diver he has is exposed to exterior sea pressure. Verne didn't apparently consider that when you double your depth, you increase your air supply, your air consumption by twice. The group on an underwater excursion got tired, and they took a nap underwater. No diver would think that that's a good idea. Verne got an underwater excursion, descending down to 500 feet would be lethal without a gas mixture. He didn't understand that. Nobody at the time had made any real attempts to go down to those depths and reach those pressures. But the nitrogen narcosis, the bends, a whole series of things would start to hurt you at those depths. Now the underwater rifles, I know in the movies they had what looked like some type of electric ray gun, but the underwater rifles he fired were basically air rifles that shot taser rounds. Again, his fixation on electricity. So he basically invented the taser, although the charge was lethal. Next slide. These are some of the things we see on the underwater excursion. We see his diving suit, see a relatively small tank on the back of that guy in the diving suit. We see people mining, and they search a lot of wrecks for treasure, sunken treasure. They're very good at it, and they brought it back up to the surface and try to do some good for it by helping usually resistance movements and people who are oppressed. And one excursion to see Atlantis, where the volcano that submerged Atlantis is still blasting. Next. Okay, up to you, Merle.
Okay, so now we're back to some other things that Verne did. This is his classic horror story, The Carpentian Castle, which was fairly late in his career. But what's interesting with this is similar to the kinds of issues that we see with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he became much more focused on accuracy, because it's like Wells talks about in his approach. You take one impossible, improbable, and make that the core of your story and try to make everything else as accurate as you can. So this story is basically about a Transylvania castle where the mysterious spooky things are going on, including lights, booming noises, spectral manifestations, and electrical discharges. By the end of the story, you discover it's all done with projected images and phonograph records, but he has tremendous detail on the customs, history, mythology, and the places in Transylvania. And some people claim that this was the setting was used as inspiration for the Dracula story. Another one that he had was the Beecham's Fortune, which was kind of a showpiece where you had two individuals inherit a fortune from an Indian prince, and it was divided between a Frenchman and a German. And this is where all the national racial stereotypes and things come in. This was actually a manuscript that was done by a Corsican revolutionary, but because he was in prison, he couldn't publish under his own name. So Verne's publisher brought it to Verne and said, jazz this thing up. So he built this story that basically was where two men got these fortunes and convinced the Americans to give them little Pacific islands off the Pacific coast to build cities from scratch. One was Ville-de-France and the other was Stahlstadt, the Steel City. One is French because it's egalitarian, healthy and bright, and very laissez-faire government. And one is a tight dictatorship making weapons, desiring to conquer the other, and more. So basically, Stahlstadt failed because its leader was so heavily centralized and had central decision-making that he died in a weapons test, and his city fell apart and went into bankruptcy. So the French wound up winning, which doesn't sound like the Franco-Prussian War at all, but oh well. The things that were fantastic and science-related were a super cannon with gas shells that would freeze victims, and the whole thing about the Germans versus the French was pretty heavy-handed. Then we moved into Paris in the 20th century, and he wrote this story thinking that it was going to be Paris in 1960. He wrote it in 1863, but it wasn't rediscovered until 1994, not published in English until 1996. It's a dystopian view of the future. His publisher originally thought that he shouldn't publish it because it was too fantastic. But this is the kind of stuff that he predicted in that story. Cars with internal combustion engines, gas stations, asphalt roads, elevated and underground passenger trains, skyscrapers, lights on at night all the time. Picture telegraphs. Elevators, primitive computers that could send messages, wind power, the electric chair, remotely controlled weapons. Does this sound like modern day? It's kind of scary. And weapons destructive enough to make war unthinkable. This is classic building blocks for steampunk. So now we're going to move to Wells, and that's Doug.
Well, H.G. Wells hit his stride in his career in 1895. He was born around 1865. And in 1895, he began cranking out what we now think of as classic science fiction stories. The Time Machine was one of the first. The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, which was really quite a metaphorical story about what certain powers could do for and to a person and what happens if they're not reversible. War of the Worlds, of course, is the best known, the great classic, which, among other things, introduced the idea that an alien species that would be completely superior to humans might be totally vulnerable to microbes that don't bother us much. When the Sleeper Wakes, the first Men in the Moon, there's your, again, your story of how humans might get to a world other than the Earth. The War in the Air, a lot of foreseeing of what aerial warfare might be in the 20th century. The World Set Free, which is, I'm sure, something we will cover in greater depth because it's a very, very strange and interesting and wonderful story, again, reflecting way ahead some things that would happen. So he's born in 1866. Okay, I had remembered about that. 1968. He died in 1948. He had started off as an apprentice draper, then as a school teacher, moved into for journals. So he actually, unlike Verne, had some scientific background and much more of an interest in getting the scientific aspects of the story right. He was also a socialist with bohemian tastes, which means basically the free thinkers all over Europe who thought they would build one utopian world. He's convincing by instilling commonplace detail alongside a single extraordinary assumption. It was actually called Wells' Law. You create the plausible, impossible story by having all the details pretty much accurate, except having this one odd assumption and what if. Next slide. So among the things he predicted, genetic science, we're looking at some of the information from War of the Worlds and other places. Laser weapons, that's War of the Worlds. Biological warfare. Inadvertent in the case of War of the Worlds, but still, if it could happen by chance, it could happen by design. Air warfare. The sexual ideas about how sex roles might change and expectations might change. The whole idea of having suburbs around cities. They didn't have suburbs at the turn of the 20th century, but he recognized that the development of new forms of transportation and communication might make such things not only possible, but quite desirable, and there would be a lot of them. Moving walkways, ever seen the people moving? Well, guess who thought of that first? A file in which people could contribute information, and this would be what a great advance over having to go to the library and look it up and know where to look it up. He predicted a federalized Europe, which I think many people at the time were seeing as not only a possibility, but a necessity, because people could see the conflict as what the alternative was going to be if they didn't manage to find some form of overall. He came up with a form of atomic bombs, and they're nothing like what we actually have, but at least he recognized recognized that there was a source of energy that could conceivably be harnessed and put to military use. And perhaps most striking, he came up with the idea of wireless communication. Marconi, by this time, we had the telegraph for years. Marconi had come up with the wireless radio, as we then called it, the wireless telegraph. But the whole idea of wireless communication and what it might become, Wells was well ahead of his time. On to you.
Okay, thanks. We're discussing Time Machine, one of his first classics, and I include some of the pictures from the Hollywood movies, not necessarily that those were true to form, but this is 1960, the Rod Taylor classic. Hypothesizes a time machine built by an inventor who is never named in the book. In fact, the book is, again, like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, first-person narrative, the time traveler. The prologue and epilogue discuss people clustered at his home waiting for him, and then he described him coming in, and then he starts telling his story, and that's just of the book. So the author investigates possible human future. There's more social commentary than technological. In the future, he describes all technological civilization as collapsed, so there's nothing really described as far as the technology. But how we get from here to there is intriguing in terms of the way Wells saw things. Next slide. Now, in the book, there's the Eloy and the Morlocks. They are two separate species that are descended from humans. Unlike the movies that you see, it's not a disaster, not type of war, natural disaster, but it's just a natural long-term separation, Darwinian separation, evolution of privileged and proletarian classes that eventually split the human species in two. What happens is the privileged classes, the wealthy, remained above ground, where they pushed all the ugly workers, the ugly people, the ugly industries, all the ugliness of society down into the basement. And they went deeper and deeper. And ultimately, you had an upper class who lived in a paradise, and you had a lower class that became more and more focused on what they were going to do. They weren't they weren't inventive thinkers, but they were very good at what they had to do. Well, the people on the top side ended up becoming useless and not able to function on their own, really. And at some point, Wells hypothesizes that after they've cured disease, after they've cured all form of predators, after war has ceased, there is no stressors on humanity that required us by Darwinian existence to maintain a cutting edge. And then at some point, some natural disaster or disaster of some type that he does not specify, the time traveler never learns what it is, the society just kind of collapsed. And the people on the top ended up being unable to take care of themselves, and the people below realized they had the power. But nobody anymore had the inventiveness to be able to carry on human society. Now, Wells' nature as a socialist coming through, perhaps also his rearing in English society, which is more stratified than others. He doesn't seem to recognize, the world's becoming less stratified by industrialization, not more. Well, there were labor movements, unions, laws, strikes, socialism, and social programs. They're all going to put a damper in the kind of separation that he was talking about. Now, at the very end, the time traveler goes far into the future. He discusses the sun swelling into a red giant. He understood that. The astronomers were understanding that, so that was accurate. The sun stopped moving. As he was going faster and faster, the sun turns into a blur in the sky, but it eventually slows and stops as the Earth becomes tidally locked. Probably inaccurate. The Earth won't ever become tidally locked in the sun. But he does project that about 40 million years in the future, it'll probably be closer to 4 billion. Relativity theory, or E equals mc squared, is a consequence of relativity theory. It was not developed yet when he wrote this book. So the sun's longevity was not understandable by the science when he wrote it. And just some gratuitous pictures. Hollywood Morlocks, some gratuitous pictures. The Time Machine, of course, 1960 and 2002. And then, of course, in the lower left, we have the Big Bang Theory, who bought one of those model time machines thinking they were buying a model. It's a great episode. Next. And the really gratuitous pictures. Now, interesting, the Weena character was not a sexual being in the book at all. He did not barely recognize Weena as human. Weena wasn't human. It was more of a father-daughter relationship. But Hollywood had to take and cast these babes in the roles. And spoiler alert, Weena does not survive in the book. I'm sorry about that, but he had no reason to go back to her. And in the book, there's no in the 1960 movie, he went back to try to save that society. In the 2002 movie, he never came back to the 19th century at all. He just stayed there. In the book, he disappeared, and nobody knows where he went. But he had no reason to return to the Eloy Morlock thing. Next. All right, up to you, Merle.
So one of the other themes that we start seeing more of in steampunk is the mad scientist, somebody who interferes with nature or does the thing and goes, "Oh my Lord, what I have done." And the island of Dr. Moreau is the classic prototype of that, where the doctor on this island were turning men into beasts through surgery, and it was an exploration of pain and cruelty and the moral responsibility of scientists to do the right thing. It had a lot to do with, you know, what's really human, because as he made these half-human and proto-human surgical adjustments, it's sort of a hint towards genetic engineering later. They become more human-like, but not quite. So it's really the prototype, and then what we're trying to show there is the link. The other is The Invisible Man, which what's really interesting is the subtitle was it was a grotesque romance, because this story was about a guy who was by the name of Griffin who changed his body's refractive index so it would match air, so light would go through him. He couldn't reverse it. So eventually he got alienated from society and was kind of depressed because he couldn't reverse it, started getting into drink and the delusion that science was going to be his only answer. So he started using all of his resources to research a cure. But over time, he became more and more distraught and more dehumanized and started taking out violent actions on people in order to get resources to support himself, like money. He started a fire in one of his landlord's places and got more and more into random and irresponsible violence and a sense of his power over others, and basically vowed revenge against all that stood in his way. Ultimately, he was driven to self-destruction, where people had to destroy him, and he became visible in death. What's also interesting with that is, if he really had changed his refractive index, he wouldn't be able to see, because the back of the eye needs to absorb light for you to be able to see color and things. The other novel that I wanted to highlight here is The Sleeper Awakes, which was one of the last novels of the Victorian era proper, where he had a character by the name of Graham who fell asleep in a coma in 1897 and woke up in 2100. What's really interesting about this is he had investments and investment counselors, and his investment corporation made basically such wise investments that when he woke up, he was the legal owner of the world. And then he managed to deal with, become a symbol and a puppet for a revolution to overthrow the White Council, and then discovered people were still oppressed and led his own counter-revolution. So back to Mark.
Okay, War of the Worlds. We'll slide through some pictures. I see we're running pretty late, but next slide. I like that I like the cartoon cover on the right side. I had that as a kid. I wish I had it now. It's probably worth a fortune. Next one. Okay, now War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, it takes place in his current time, so it's Wells' law. The world as you know it, plus this one little thing. The Martians happen to land. So we can't really talk much about the technology of the time being unusual, but I just want to point out, yes, Mars is, there's a technological civilization on Mars. That's not really right, because reality is Mars is uninhabitable, at least by any life form that would thrive on Earth. So if there were Martians, they wouldn't be interested in this planet. The hit, though, is the Martians are destroyed by Earth germs against which they had no tolerance. This is written in the day when the germ theory of infectious disease was not totally accepted. It's more better known than it was in Verne's day, but I have to ask why the technologically superior Martians didn't see that coming and take some precautions. Next slide. Just some more gratuitous pictures from various movies. And now let's move on to The World Set Free. This is one of his later books. It's written, he wrote it in 1913 and into 1914 was first published. At that point, all of Europe saw that there was a war coming, and much of the book is written toward this. Now, this is almost H.G. Wells' sermon as to how the world should be, what's wrong with it, and how it's going to be set free. His frequent theme is that humans' mastery of power and technology is a detriment to the determinant of human progress. Now, it starts out in 1914 with the release of, quote, atomic energy. Now, at this point, E equals mc squared was known. He doesn't reference it at any point, but his example of atomic energy was radium decay. Radium decay is creating what they recognize to be a huge amount of energy for its size, but it takes such a long time to do. So to Wells, atomic energy was a discussion of how to harness and speed up the rate of radioactive decay, which relieves a tremendous amount of energy. Next slide. As an example, cars were backfitted with atomic engines. So it's not nuclear power or nuclear reactors the way we would know it now. It's a small engine that ran off some type of a decay. When a few years, the car, he said, would now go on a few pennies completely across the United Kingdom. All industries are similarly overhauled, and mankind transforms itself over in a matter of a few decades with limitless free energy and technologies, etc. But there is a problem with that. Go on. Next slide. The new technology industries are only half the problem. In Wells' view, the greater problems are obsolete educational and political systems. Of course, he was living in an age of monarchs and aristocracy. So those people are still running things, and so that while the scientists should be making decisions logically, they should be running things, they weren't. So he said the war is the inevitable result of the modern state. So this is his commentary on class warfare. Next slide. Now, he doesn't have war start. World War I starts, and this is actually a combination of World Wars I, II, and III. But World War I starts in 1956, and this is a nuclear war. The Central Powers versus the UK, France, Russia alliance. Great. It was World War I, just 42 years late. Now, he had to have some time for the technology he was going to describe to evolve. Now, atomic bombs are based on radioactive decay technology. They're not the enormous city-busting things, but they're a bomb that has huge energy, and it lands, it explodes, and every time more air hits it, explodes again. So you have this bomb going off again and again and again. You drop a bomb in a city, and it's going to be exploding for years. So it's not what we're envisioning. The atomic bombs are carolinium, which was thought to be isolated from thorium, but it was diffused. It didn't really exist. Wells used the name. Apparently, he thought it was nice. So 17-day half-life, so never entirely exhausted. Quote from the book: "To this day, the battlefields and bomb fields of that frantic time in human history, specifically the 1956 war, are sprinkled with radiant matter and so centers of inconvenient rays, i.e. radiation." Next slide. As an example, bombing Berlin. The Germans bomb Paris, so the French bomb Berlin. The bomber he describes as a tandem two-seat monoplane open cockpit. This is 1956. Of course, in real life we had jet fighters, but he wrote this in 1914. So this is the image of what an impressive plane is. It flies to Berlin. He's jumped by German defending aircraft fighters who are also in open cockpit tandem two-seat monoplanes with snipers in the back seat. Now, that's of course how the first shooting from one plane to another started in World War I. He just has it happening a little late. The bomber evades, and then the backseater picks the atomic bombs up from the floor at his feet and rolls them over the side to bomb Berlin. That's how to deploy atomic bombs. But out of the destruction of the war, they hold a Council of Nations. They introduction of atomic energy in a world divided resulted in the collapse of society, and their choices either to return to agriculture barbarism or the acceptance of achieved science as the basis of a new social order. As an example, he has the British king. He's H.G. Wells. He can talk about the king abdicates in favor of the world state in order to set the example, and the world government is presented as the solution to the threat of nuclear weapons. Next slide. So hits or misses, and these are quotes from the book, and it kind of makes sense. Certainly it seems now that nothing could have been more obvious to the people of the early 20th century than the rapidity with which war was becoming impossible. And certainly they did not see it. They did not see until the atomic bombs burst in their fumbling hands. how accurate? We don't know that yet, but it certainly seems to be prophetic. All through the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of energy that men were able to command was continually increasing. Applied to warfare, that meant that the power to inflict a blow, the power to destroy, was continually increasing. There was no increase whatever in the ability to escape. Destruction was becoming so facile that never mind, I missed that one. Okay, now, this is Leo Szilard, who's involved in later involved in the Manhattan Project, and first came up with the idea of a neutron-induced chain reaction in 1932. Read the book in 1932. 1933, he conceived the neutron chain reaction. So Wells' atomic bomb theory might have had something to do with the actual development itself.
So we want to thank you so much for joining us here at DragonCon. We hope you have a healthy and safe time. If any of you are interested in helping to join the National Security Decision-Making staff, we would love to have you come and hang out with us. Send us a message on Facebook.